Thank you, Dr. Dembski. We're going to go ahead and actually pick up cards for those of you who would like to ask a question. If you could pass those cards to the aisles, we'll have some people around to pick up those cards, and those cards will make their way up to me after we hear the rebuttals from each of our speakers. So, Mr. Hitchens, 10 minutes for a rebuttal?
I'll try and do less if I can, because I'd rather reserve time for questions if possible. But yes, after all, I've been challenged on a number of fronts, and that's what I enjoy. I was trying to think of something that I agreed with, but I found I had to disagree almost ab initio, as it were. An atheist does not have to be an evolutionist. Atheism long predates the discoveries. Atheism long predates the revolutionary discoveries of Charles Darwin. There was a time when the word scientist didn't exist. Actually, the word scientist is a late 19th century coinage that I sometimes feel we could do without. In the time of Sir Isaac Newton, for example, people who did the work of the sort that he did were called natural philosophers. And I think that it's important to realize that science is not just the study of the material world or laboratories. I mean, after all, Sir Isaac Newton may have been a very, very, very great scientist, but he maintained a furnace in his room in Cambridge at all times because he was also an alchemist and believed he would one day find out how to turn base metals into gold. He's one of a long line of people who were genius crackpots. He believed, for example, that the Pope was the Antichrist. Maybe it's true. And that if you could find the measurements of the old temple, that would be far more useful than knowing what the measurements of gravity were. But he was a natural scientist. He knew absolutely nothing about evolution. The work of Spinoza, the work of Voltaire, the work of Lucretius. Admittedly, Lucretius did work out Democritus and Epicurus as well at that period of the Hellenistic period. They did work out the world was made of atoms, a very brilliant thing for them to have done at the time. The mystery to me is only this, because none of these things necessarily depend on one another, why it is that organized religion has always been so hostile to discoveries of this sort, why it should take them so personally. The work of Lucretius, De Rerum Naturam, that established that we're made of atoms, and so is the rest of the system, was hated by the church for centuries. Only about 1 or 2 copies of it were allowed to survive. They didn't want you to know this. As you know, the church didn't want Galileo to look through a tube and see, would make the disconcerting discovery that the sun doesn't go round us, we go round the sun. I presume now no one is going to give me an argument about that today. Why would anyone care which way it worked? Well, because if the sun doesn't go round us, we're not the center of the universe, which makes it, doesn't it, fractionally less likely that we're the objects of the whole thing. If we revolve around something else, it could be we're not the sole object of a huge cosmic divine design. So what I've been trying to attack today, and I've given no reason to want to attack it less, is this reassuring idea that it's all about us, this solipsistic, selfish, I think, unscientific idea. The work of Darwin and later of innumerable writers, many of whom are Christian, on evolution shows that there's absolutely no necessity at all for an incompatibility between a private belief in God and a recognition that we arose out of natural selection and random mutation. Let me just take the question of the eye. I think Dr. Dembski said I was obsessed with it. That's absolutely not true. It's simply that Darwin himself doubted at first that the eye could have evolved, given its complexity, and because the eye is the example most commonly brought up, so I thought, okay, in my book I'll take the most complex and the most difficult and the most well-known example. And you can look at my book, or you can look at a very brilliant chapter in Richard Dawkins's book, Climbing Mount Improbable, beautiful short chapter on the 25 different evolutions of the eye and the different ways in which it's taken place. I have contributed to this because I'm not a scientist. Only one small thing, but I'll give it to you anyway. You may have seen, you should have seen, a wonderful series made by the British Broadcasting Corporation called Planet Earth. It's the greatest photography of the natural world you'll ever see. It's absolutely extraordinary. And in one very fascinating case, they go to Indonesia, which has the largest caves we know underground on Earth, which have a whole series of life forms inside them, many of them not fully understood or explored yet, including a large number of life forms that we do already understand that fell into those caves when they were formed and ceased to live on the Earth's surface and in the sunlight and started to make their lives underground. They are more or less exactly the same as they would be if they had remained where they were, but I noticed the salamander, the beautiful Indonesian lizard. Everyone's seen one in a zoo. There it was. It had been living for, David Attenborough told us in the program, X millions of years away from the sunlight in a cave. It had eyes. No, it didn't. It had perfectly eye-shaped indentations, exactly where the eyes used to be, like a little sketch or outline of an eye, but no socket. The socket had gone, the eye itself had gone. All you could see was the vestigial. It had adapted. It had decided to lose its eye. Most of our studies are about how people got hold of eyes. Dawkins's is the best one, whatever Dr. Dembski may say, of the different ways in which different creatures got different eyes. But no one until your humble servant, because I wrote off to my friends and my enemies and said, has anyone noticed this before, had thought, now how do animals lose their eyes? The same way they got them, by not needing them anymore, by adapting away. If you live underground in the wet, in the dark, it's a big hazard to your survival to have a wet, useless spot that can't receive any light, two of them on your face. It can pick up infection, it can make you vulnerable. You lose it. It takes millions of years, but you'll lose it. That's what we're talking about, adaptability. Wrongly, it's said that Darwin talked of the survival of the fittest. People draw often cruel and inhuman conclusions from this and attribute it to Darwin. Didn't say anything of the sort. What he said is adaptability is what helps survival. If I told you that in parts of Africa where elephants are shot for their tusks, elephants are growing shorter tusks in reaction, you would, I'm sure, laugh. How would the elephant know how to do that? Elephant sees hunter, works out hunter wants tusk, is an ivory hunter, shrinks tusks to minimize chance of being shot. Don't be ridiculous. Well, no, that isn't, of course, what happens. What happens is the ones with long tusks get shot quite a lot. And the ones with shorter or no tusks have, therefore, greatly enhanced opportunities of being the ones who survive and breed. And their descendants actually have shorter or no tusks. That's what adaptability is. That's what evolution is. It's not some kind of trick. In the time I've got, that's the best I can do on those points, on that point, because I want to come, in what remains to me, to the allegations made about my theology. Well, the archaeologists of the State of Israel, after the 1967 war, when Israel became, for many years, the possessor of the Sinai Peninsula, it's now given it back, and of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the biblical territories, had an unprecedented opportunity to show that the Bible story was archaeologically provable. And they were told by the founding leader of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, go out, dig, find, he said, dig up the title deeds of our state. They had the strongest motive and the greatest opportunity any archaeologists have ever had. And the standard of Israeli archaeology is already extremely high, as you can tell from their national museums and the work of many great archaeologists such as Professor Finkelstein. And they had many years to do it. They couldn't find a single trace of anything that was remotely compatible with the story of the Exodus, the wandering, and the conquest of Canaan. Not one trace. On the other hand, what they could find, with the help of Egyptian archives, was enormous evidence in the opposite direction. Digging Up History is the book. It's very easy to get, very easy to read. It's a very impressive demonstration of what I call, and this is what to look for when you're looking for intellectual honesty in life, evidence against interest. In other words, people will say, I really wished, I really hoped I could find this. This was my ambition. Here is how. It wasn't compatible, wasn't doable in the light of the facts. I regard that as a very impressive piece of objective work on the part of Israeli scholarship. If you think that Jesus isn't a historical figure, it really only matters to you. What do I mean by that? For me, the most important thinker is Socrates, and the most important source of morality and philosophical comfort, by far. There's no evidence that Socrates existed either. It's not conclusive. That's to say, we only have, as we have in the case of Jesus, second-hand eyewitness reports of him. They're pretty persuasive, but they're not conclusive. He never wrote anything down, neither did Jesus. The stories about him are much more compatible than the ones of Jesus. The four Gospels contradict each other about everything from his birth, the circumstances of it, the flight into Egypt, very crucially, in all four cases, on the crucifixion and the resurrection. All of them, just read them for yourselves. I'm sure you must have read them by now. The discrepancies are extraordinary. They don't amount to a historical figure in the same way as we know from coinage, from building, from parchments, not parchments, but from documents, tablets, things, that Alexander the Great, for example, was a historical figure. But to me, if Socrates didn't exist, it wouldn't matter. Because we have his method, we have his teaching, and he teaches us what, I loop back now to Dr. Dembski's first element of his critique, to having to know that to be educated is to understand how little you know and how little you understand. Dr. Dembski seems to think he's laid some kind of gigantic egg that's about to hatch a huge squawking chicken, when he points out that among evolutionists and among physicists and others, there are huge differences and disagreements. That's true. It's also going to get much, much more intense. If you want to see a really strong argument take place, go and talk to Richard Dawkins and ask him about his view of Stephen Jay Gould's, another great paleontologist, arguments on punctuated evolution. There are tremendous differences within our school. There's a huge amount yet to be known or explained. But we don't take anything on faith. There's no dogma. There are no tablets. We go where the evidence leads us. And for example, when the last outbreak of flu virus occurred, because we know something about the genetic things we have in common with bacteria and viruses, and we were able to sequence the DNA of the last such virus in 1919, didn't take us very long to get a vaccine that could prevent the last flu from being as bad as the previous one. It works. It works. You can make sound medical predictions based on it. Medicine's impossible without the work of evolution and genetics. And you should be grateful for it. But it doesn't mean there's no God. It just means that we have what we think are better explanations for our human nature. I think that runs me out perfectly.
It does.
And again, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Dembski.
Very good. The topic of this debate is on the existence and goodness of God, and I want to focus on in this next 10 minutes on the goodness of God, arguing for that. But I do want to just say a few things about some of the comments that Christopher Hitchens just made. The claim that atheism predates evolution. I mean, it's certainly true that atheism predates Darwin's theory of evolution, but the idea that nature, the material world, is all there is, that there are no gods, no transcendent intelligence, nothing beyond this material world, that is an old notion, and those notions often have, I mean, if that's all you've got, nature basically has to do its own creating, its own self-organizing. And it's not surprising then that in the materialist philosophers of old, Christopher mentions Lucretius, for instance, you have a prototype of Darwinian evolution, of natural selection in his De Rerum Natura. I mean, I read this with my students. So evolutionary ideas go back a long way. They don't take precisely the form of Darwinism, but if you are an atheist, that's really the only game in town. Matter, the natural world, has to organize itself. And if you look at the old creation myths, Enuma Elish, the Greek creation myths, Hesiod's theogony, what you find are natural forces, the cosmic egg, the waters, Tiamat and Apsu, sweet and salt waters in the Babylonian mythology, and they organize themselves, and then finally at the end you get Marduk, the prince of the gods. So you go from simplicity to complexity, and that's always the direction of evolution. Now it's interesting, he brings up vestigiality, the cave fish. It's a very different thing losing an eye and gaining an eye. I mean, if you have an eye, you go put the fish in a cave, you have these cave fish, and all you need to do is disable some gene or some promoter or something, and the eye is gone, and it's not needed. Evolution doesn't have to try to get it back because it's gone and it's not needed. But getting the eye in the first place, that's the problem. That's where the design comes in. Christopher mentions the appendix. Actually, the appendix has a use. I mean, it's recently been found that it's a repositor of these probiotics. And it's been implicated in the immune system. I mean, that's been known actually for a number of years. But so whenever you ascribe vestigiality, you are in danger of making an argument from ignorance, because it may be that some use ends up being found, although I would admit that with the cave fish, that's not going to happen. The claim that medicine would be impossible without evolution, what are we talking about? I mean, nobody in the intelligent design community doubts that Darwin, or let me put it positively, everybody accepts that Darwin got something right. The point is, how big of a picture, how much did he get right? Natural selection certainly operates. It explains how bacteria will gain antibiotic resistance, how insects will get insecticide resistance, but it doesn't explain how you get bacteria or insects in the first place. And that's the big claim. That's the whopper that we are being asked to believe on materialist grounds. And there's no evidence for that. Small-scale evolutionary change is no problem. They can follow Darwinian patterns. We accept that. But this is always a problem in science, where you take a theory, get a good idea, and then you try to totalize it and apply it to everything. And what you find is that usually after time, you find that the scope of the theory needs to be contracted and that there is a proper range of applicability of the theory. And that's, I think, what we found with Darwin. So Darwin was a great scientist. I don't mean to take anything away from him, but this totalization of Darwin has continued. And to mention Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins, if you read Stephen Jay Gould's great tome at the end, this 1,400-page brontosaurus of a book on the structure of evolution, what you find is that he, in the end, capitulates to Darwin, that Darwin got it basically right. Punctuated equilibrium is just a slight modification. It's not a revolution within Darwinian thinking. So I could go on about this, but I do want to address the goodness of God, since that is also a stated topic of the debate. So last time I argued that God exists. The next order of business is to establish God's goodness. It's here that Hitchens mounts his loudest attack against religious people and against God himself. His motto in such attacks is, heads I win, tails you lose. Thus, if religious people behave badly, that counts against God. On the other hand, if they behave well, that means nothing, because non-religious people can behave well also. In establishing God's goodness, let's therefore first level the playing field. The 6th century Christian philosopher Boethius helps us here. In his Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius states the following paradox. If God exists, whence evil? But whence good if God does not exist? Boethius contrasts the problem that evil poses for theism with the problem that good poses for atheism. The problem of good does not receive nearly as much attention as the problem of evil, but it is the more basic problem. That's because evil always presupposes a good that has been subverted or corrupted. All our words for evil make this plain. The New Testament word for sin, Greek hamartia, presupposes a target that's been missed. Deviation presupposes a way, a via, Latin via, from which we've departed. Injustice presupposes justice, and so on. So let's ask, who's got the worst problem, the theist or the atheist? Start with the theist. God is the source of all being and purpose. Given God's existence, what sense does it make to deny God's goodness? None. Indeed, denying God's goodness is logically and rationally incoherent. It's absurd. To see this, consider what it would mean to assert that God is not good. Presumably, this would mean that God violated some moral standard. Whose moral standard? One devised by Christopher Hitchens? God owes Hitchens nothing, nor does he owe us any. He owes us nothing either. I want to add that. To say that God is not good must therefore mean that God has violated an objective moral standard. But since God is the source of all being and purpose, any such objective moral standard cannot reside outside God. Such a standard must therefore derive from God himself. But in that case, how can God violate it? God himself is the standard then. God's goodness follows as a matter of definition once God's existence is taken for granted. This may seem like a cheat, but it's not. The problem of evil still confronts theists, though not as a logical or philosophical problem, but instead as a psychological or existential one. The problem of evil can therefore be reformulated as the following argument. Since God is good, he wants to destroy evil. Since God is all-powerful, he can destroy evil. Evil is not yet destroyed. Therefore, God will eventually destroy evil. As time-bound creatures, our problem here is with the word eventually. We want to see evil destroyed now. And because we don't see it destroyed now, and thus experience the suffering that evil invariably inflicts, we are tempted to doubt God's existence and goodness. Our challenge, therefore, is to continue trusting God until evil is destroyed. Hitchens' long litany of evils, especially those committed in the name of religion, is designed to derail our trust in God's goodness by getting us to think that if God really were good, he would have taken care of evil by now. I want to just go back because I think I wasn't quite as clear as I wanted to be. In terms of God's goodness, it seems either we are going to have to admit that God is the standard because everything follows from him, or we're going to have to refer the goodness to some subjective standard of some creature, but that God himself is not going to be bound by that. That cannot be the standard of goodness ultimately. So yes, I would argue, and I have argued, that once you have God, it really is incoherent to affirm that God isn't good. But as I said, there's still a problem when we have to deal with evil in the world. And I'm leaving this argument at a pretty general philosophical level. I mean, I'm not, the debate topic, I'm trying to stay with this, is the existence and goodness of God. And I'm taking God very generically. I'm not getting into specifics of Christian theology. I'm treating this more as a question in philosophy of religion. Okay, so we have now the existential problem of evil. God's goodness in the face of the world's evil is, as Boethius noted, a problem. It's not an insuperable problem, but neither is it a trivial one. By contrast, the problem of good in the face of God's non-existence, the other half of Boethius's paradox, is, I submit, insuperable. The problem of good as it faces the atheists is this, and you need to pay close attention here. Nature, which is nuts and bolts reality for the atheist, has no values and thus can offer no grounding for good and evil. As 19th century freethinker Robert Greene Ingersoll used to say, in nature there are neither rewards nor punishments, there are only consequences. By the way, my dad was a biologist, he taught evolutionary biology, and this was one of his favorite expressions growing up. Ingersoll made this comment in the 19th century. More recently, Richard Dawkins has made the same point. Quote, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Close quote. Values on the atheist view are subjective and contingent. They reflect inclinations to behave and feel in certain ways given the conditions of survival and reproduction under which our ancestors evolved and the social conditions under which we've been reared. Hitchens speaks of moral values as being innate and waxes indignant when they are violated. But on atheist principles, what is the force of morality and what justifies such indignation? Hitchens, for instance, is incensed with religious communities that practice female genital mutilation. So am I. But without an objective moral standard, which atheism cannot deliver, Hitchens himself is at bottom a complicated piece of matter that evolutionary and social conditioning have inclined to react in certain ways to certain behaviors. In particular, he reacts quite negatively to this practice. But religious communities that engage in this practice are quite content to continue it. Moreover, on atheistic principles, they have the better argument, for they are surviving and reproducing quite nicely, indeed out-reproducing the secular West. On atheist principles, morality is, as Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson note, an illusion fobbed off by our genes to get us to cooperate. This statement by Ruse and Wilson is very widely quoted, but too often the punchline gets omitted. Let me read you the punchline. This comes at the end of that passage. Morality or ethics is illusory. Okay, they've just said that it's an illusion. It's illusory, but why? Inasmuch as it persuades us that it has an objective reference. That's the punchline. See, for morality to work, it has to convince us that there's an objective reference, because if we realize that it's just bunk, then we're not going to do it. We have to be deluded into thinking that there is an objective moral standard to which we have to bow down. And as long as we're deluded in that way, then we can be moral. So this is their point. That's the kicker. Christopher Hitchens is morally earnest. So is the female genital mutilation community. Try to convince either and get into the fight of your life. But their passionate moral convictions on atheist principles merely show that they fooled themselves into thinking that morality is objective and universally binding. No, on atheist principles, all that's going on is one group of material objects. Enlightenment rationalists like Christopher Hitchens are inclined to one set of behaviors, and another group of material objects, female genital mutilators, inclined to another set of behaviors. Just to be clear, and I'm going to go over just a moment, I think I went under the last time, I'm not saying that atheists can't act morally or have moral knowledge. But when I ascribe virtue to an atheist, it's as a theist who sees atheists as conforming to objective moral standards. The atheist, by contrast, has no such basis for morality, and yet all moral judgments require a basis for morality, some standard of right and wrong. So the atheist is cheating whenever he makes a moral judgment, acting as though it has an objective reference when it does not. But perhaps such cheating is inconsequential. The American pragmatist philosopher C.S. Peirce held that for a difference to be a difference, it has to make a difference. Christopher Hitchens claims that atheists can behave just as morally as theists. In fact, he claims that they will behave better than theists because religion poisons everything. At the end of his book, he therefore poses the following question: name an ethical statement or action made or performed by a person of faith that could not have been made or performed by a non-believer. I have since asked this question at every stop and haven't yet had a reply. Close quote. But Hitchens has posed the wrong question. Since God exists and has created us, we all have moral knowledge built into us by God and thus are capable of performing the same ethical actions. Hitchens' question therefore answers itself. A far more interesting question would have been, given a moral action, what is the profile of those who engage or refrain in engaging in it? And do religious as well as anti-religious factors play a significant role here? Consider eugenics, euthanasia, and abortion. Those who oppose these actions are largely people of faith. They see humanity as made in God's image, and therefore human life is sacred. Accordingly, it would be a profanation for them to engage in these acts. Conversely, those who embrace these actions are largely anti-religious secularists. They see humans as evolved mammals, pieces of complicated matter in motion with no transcendent value. Obviously, then, theism and atheism have profoundly different moral consequences. Here's a difference that makes a difference. At the heart of this difference is the existence and goodness of God. And for that last thing on eugenics and euthanasia and abortion, I would refer you to John West's book, Darwin Day in America. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Dembski. Christopher, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes on 5 minutes on the goodness of God. Okay, never one to refuse a challenge. I don't really know what it's like being a Christian, but it seems to me that if I was one, there are reasons I would want to object to the Dembski view. First, I think this attempt to prove the existence of God by what we would normally call something like scientific evidence, which is a restless need that the religious have, I think partly because we keep taunting them with not ever coming up with enough conclusive evidence, so they keep coming up with more. I mean, after all, the Big Bang was actually originally thought of by a Catholic priest in holy orders at the University of Louvain. in Belgium, and he took it to the Pope, Pope Leo, I think it was, who said, well, if you like, I'll make it official dogma. I'll say that Christians have to believe it. And the professor said, well, no, Your Holiness, that's not quite what I mean. But very often when, not in this case, but when something marvelous and various and awe-inspiring, like the theory of evolution or the theory of the Big Bang, is finally accepted by most, if not all people, Christians simply say, well, that just proves God is even more ingenious than we thought. He must be responsible for all that too. Please always beware of an argument that appears to explain everything. It's very likely to explain nothing. But there's another reason why I think I would be a little uneasy at arguments of this kind that try and wrench evidence into theological shape. This is my question for you to ponder, where's the need for faith in that case? If it can be proved in the same way as a proposition of mine has to be proved or has to fall, what need for faith? What need for the suffering, the struggle to achieve faith and maintain it? There'd be no need for faith if there really was evidence, would there? I'd love to know how you bridge this gap. Perhaps someone in the question period will supply me with a thought there. And then another reason why I would steer very clear of this idea of making God responsible, not just for our existence, but for our behavior and for what happens to us, is it dooms you to have to keep on pestering him with plaintive questions that don't have an answer. I found a complete point of agreement with Dr. Dembski. It's absolutely true. If I was a Christian, I would not think that God owed me an explanation. There'd be something disproportionate, surely, about that, something conceited. But people do find themselves asking, if there's a God and if he's good, where is all this evil from? This is a strictly time-wasting question. Things like war and pestilence come because we are not very highly evolved animals who live on a rather climatically unstable planet and don't know very much yet about our circumstances. The way that we behave to each other is recognizable from the way that other animals behave to each other, unfortunately. But we have one very clear idea, and it's fortunately one that it's almost impossible for us to get rid of, that if we don't act responsibly to one another, whether for altruistic reasons or not, the motives don't necessarily have to be pure. But if we didn't have a social dimension, a bonding one, we wouldn't survive. We'd have gone by now. We wouldn't have made it out of Africa. The question, in a sense, answers itself. Now, you can call this morality if you want, and there certainly are some individuals who act in what appears to us to be a self-sacrificing way. And they've always got tremendous honor in all tribes, in all societies, and at all times. But it's only really necessary to recognize that we have a kinship and a solidarity, and that without it we're gone. Morality cannot be dictated to us. It doesn't come in tablet form that can be swallowed. It comes from the Socratic method of moral suasion, long reflection. Why should this be called wrong? Why would this be a dishonor? Otherwise, why do the Ten Commandments say nothing about slavery, nothing about genocide, nothing about child abuse, nothing about innumerable other things that preoccupy us and make us think, of which we think as evil, and about 4 instructions on how to worship a very jealous, capricious, and ill-tempered God? How come? If you based your morality on these tablets, you'd be missing an enormous amount of what we think of as morally urgent. Now again, I happen to be a secular humanist. I have politics of my own, fairly accurately described by Dr. Dembski. That doesn't go to the question of whether there's a God or not. You can be a supporter of Ayn Rand. I'm sure some of you have read The Fountainhead, or The Virtue of Selfishness, one of her best essays, actually, though I don't agree with it, or Atlas Shrugged. Had complete contempt for religion, but politics completely different from me. You can be an atheist and a sadist. You can be an atheist and a fascist. Most fascists actually were Roman Catholics. Doesn't matter. You can be an atheist fascist. Mussolini, I think, was an atheist. Quite rare. To be a communist, a Stalinist, it's almost a necessity to be an atheist. There are as many choices as you like. All we say is there's no supernatural dimension, there's no rescue coming to us from the unseen, there's no such thing as salvation, and we are as alone as other species are in this struggle. Sorry, looking at the clock and realizing I've run it out. Can I just then have you view that as a prod to the question period? I'd be very grateful if you'd be that generous. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to focus more on the scientific questions because that's really where I've been punching away. I think, as I said, I think from looking at Christopher Hitchens' book, it seems that ultimately the question of science and that science has given us new knowledge has been at the center of his justification of atheism insofar as he justifies it. So I want to look at a few of the scientific issues that he has raised, which I've not yet discussed. One thing that he keeps bringing up is this Copernican or super Copernican principle, the idea that Copernicus displaced us from the center of the universe. That we had been on Earth, and then everything, the heavens were going around the Earth. And when that happened, that somehow we had a pride and we knew that we were the center of God's attentions. And then somehow when that changed, when Copernicus put us revolving around the sun, then somehow our place was minimized, and then as we found that the heavens are much bigger than we ever suspected, our place has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And Carl Sagan referred to the pale blue dot, that our planet is a little dot, and that there's really nothing there, that we're very insignificant because of our small place in the cosmos. Now it's interesting. If you look at the ancients, when they saw the humans on Earth as at the center of things, they did not regard this as a place of privilege. The Earth, in this ancient conception, was a place of decay, corruption. Motions were straight because motions would come to an end. The heavens around them, that was the place of eternity. And in fact, God was thought to reside beyond these heavens that were circling the earth. So my point is just that we thought that we had this privileged, the common conception is that we had this privileged place, but actually the ancients didn't see it as a privileged place at all. They saw the privileged place as way beyond the heavens. So, yeah.
Christians did that.
Well, it was the ancients. I mean, this is Aristotle, Ptolemy, and all of this, and the Christians took it over.
I'm not arguing with them. I'm arguing with you.
Okay, all right. But
I agree with them.
But the point is that what determines our significance? I mean, Pascal said, in size the heavens swallow me up, but with my mind I comprehend the heavens. It seems that our intelligence, our language, the things that distinguish us from the other animals, that's what puts us in a privileged position. I mean, I think if size is a question of value in the ultimate scheme of things, I think G.K. Chesterton put it, then humans should have thought less of themselves because of the nearest tree. So my point is just that this principle has been used by atheists as a club to try to get us to think less of ourselves, to think that human exceptionalism doesn't hold. And this is a big theme in the atheist-theist discussion, trying to minimize the place of humanity, and it has great moral consequences because if we don't see ourselves as made in God's image, as exceptional, not in a prideful sense, but exceptional in the sense that we are made in God's image, that humans have a special place in the scheme of things, then I think you do very easily run into eugenics, euthanasia, abortion, things like that. So it is a significant point. Let me address just another issue, which is what of faith if we've got all this overwhelming evidence for design? I mean, usually the argument is made that the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. By the way, I got so tired of it that I finally bought the domain name overwhelmingevidence.com, and I also own the domain name underwhelmingevidence.com, at least I used to. So, but the thing is, what of it? I mean, design takes you only so far. I mean, I know that I've watched a few debates with Christopher Hitchens, and he knows about Kant's first critique and the whole point that the design argument, the teleological argument, does not get you to the Christian God or to a transcendent creator. It gets you to an architect of the world. Now that gets you in the right ballpark, but design gets you only so far. Having intelligent design is not a proof of the Christian God. It doesn't get you the gospel. It does not get you the tomb. It does not get you the resurrection. Intelligent design is not the gospel. Atheism remains to this day a minority position, but was much more a minority position, I would say, in the ancient world, where most people were polytheists, a few monotheists. But atheism, in the developed sense of the, let's say, the Greek atomist philosophers, has been a very small minority position. So what are we to say? That people believed in gods or the gods, but the evidence from science, it seems, takes you in the right direction, but it does not. In terms of the Christian faith, which is what I think where Christopher has his sights set, it's not going to lead you into the kingdom. So I just don't see why this worry that somehow intelligent design is going to make faith unacceptable. I would also point out that in Romans 1:20 it said that by looking at the physical world, the attributes that we can clearly understand that God has made the world. And so that was just common coin for Paul the Apostle and for many people, that yes, the world did give signs of intelligence, but still that didn't get you the faith that the Christians had. Okay, enough said.
Well, could I just say?
Yeah, in fact,
I mean it by way of applause. I think it's remarkable for Dr. Dembski to say that his scientific work doesn't have and isn't supposed to have any Christian implications. I think it's a great generous admission on your part.
Well, but it does get you in the right direction. It's friendly. I would say intelligent design is friendly to Christian theism in a way that Darwinian evolution never was and never was intended to be. If you look at Darwin toward the end of his life, he was a strong agnostic in the sense that no knowledge of any God was possible at all.